What's happening? What's going on? And how are you doing, good folks? Yeah, I have to change up my. I can't give you the actual, and when I say you, the audience, the blues radio opening when we're doing the African American Folklorist of the Month. I have to give you another one so you know we're in a different space. Same location, different space. And welcome to the African American Folklorist of the Month. And this month, we're celebrating someone who off air just shared something with me. Now I understand why every time we see each other at the conference, we have those kind of conversations, which is fine because it always keeps me on my toes. Dr. Anika Wilson, associate professor and former chair of the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at UW-Milwaukee. University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee, for those, and if I'm wrong, you could let me know. Earned her doctorate in folklore and folklife studies at the University of Pennsylvania and specializes in informal narratives, which could be considered gossip, rumors, and things of that nature. And I'm going to ask you when we talk, would you put proverbs and jokes and things into that? But let me get through your great and lengthy bio. Her her book, Folklore, Gender and AIDS in Malawi, No Secret Under the Sun, was awarded the Elli Kongas Maranda Award. I hope I said that name right, for feminist scholarship in folklore. She teaches course topics related to African and African diasporic societies, expressive cultures, spirituality, and gender relations. These are very hot topics today. Her current research project focuses on spirituality, sacred sites, and the environment in Southern Africa. Now, I've read Folklore, Gender, and AIDS in Malawi, which is an informal folk narrative genres such as gossip, advice, rumors, okay, urban legends, we get into it, would provide a unique lens through which to discern popular formations of gender conflict and AIDS belief. And I'm going to ask you about, in regards to that, what else can we apply those to in the Black community in that context, okay? This is the first book on AIDS and gender in Africa to draw primarily on such narratives by exploring tales of love, medicine, gossip about romantic rivalries, rumors of mysterious new diseases, marital advice, and stories of rape, among others. It provides rich, personally grounded insights into the everyday struggles of people living in an era marked by social upheaval. I need to get an applause button. Dr. Wilson, how are you?
I'm doing okay. It's as okay as one could be under the circumstances.
Well, I dig it. I dig it. It's hard to stay to be non-political when we're speaking on things that could be considered socially relevant, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
now I want. I will. You know what? Let's start with the work of Folklore, Gender, and AIDS in Malawi before I ask you some of these more personal questions.
We'll go to personal.
Well, personal in regards of how you got into folklore and things of
Okay.
that.
That's cool.
That kind of story. This is not an expose.
All right. All right. Don't go digging too deep back there.
No, 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 no.
I want my skeletons to just stay in those closets.
See, now you're gonna have people reaching out to me to ask why didn't I ask about those skeletons?
You five, those are going to be the most boring skeletons you ever met.
Oh my goodness. So, well, let me ask you about this because informal folk narratives, and I'm a proponent, advocate, and someone who just enjoys what I consider to be Black folk narratives, right?
Mhm.
Um, but informal, I guess, suggests there are formal folk narratives.
Mm. Yeah, I guess I am making that inference by using informal folk narratives.
But, is there formal?
I think that some things are more formalized. I think to be oral doesn't mean that there's not formal aspects of the culture, right? Like if you look at mythologies, those are things that yes, they're part of oral culture, but they're also, you know, they also have components that are a part of like your formal understanding of like what the world is like and how things operate, and then they're like also part of different rituals and things like that. So that makes them part of like very formal events and formal institutions. And so I think that some types of folk narrative are formal and some are more informal, and they're, more, so like the gossip, it's a more micro level of knowledge that people are sharing rather than something that the whole society is, has knowledge of, like an important myth. So that makes it like more informal in my,
Right.
I get to say what my definition is, and that's my definition of more in of an informal type of narrative.
Well, first and foremost, because you're a black scholar on this planets of African American folklore and the African American folklorists, you do get to define whatever you want because that's what this space is about.
There you
Okay.
go.
Now, with that being said, so when we speak of folk narrative, before we even break it down to specifics as black folk or whatever
Mhm.
ethnic or nationality, are we also talking specifically or of the oral tradition, something spoken opposed to text or something written?
I don't know. Like I think that things move in between those different realms. And so I don't always find it necessary to make stark distinctions between like, oh, this got written down, but it's still circulating in the oral at the same time, or it's moving back and forth between the oral and the written. Like when I was doing my research in Malawi in the early 2000s, I'm still doing research there, but a different project. But when I was doing research there, there would be people who would, write down their stories, what was happening in their town, what stories were coming up. They take it to the radio station, and then they would be like read on the radio station as like stories from the districts or something like that, like amazing stories from the districts. There was like a radio program. I don't know if the program is still going. That's something that's moving in and out of like oral, written, oral again, and then more people even know it. So, we have so much in terms of like the internet, where rumors are moving through the internet as well.
Right.
I don't know if it's necessary for, that's why I just say informal narrative is easier to say than like it has to be oral narrative, because who
Right.
am I to like make that distinction if people aren't making the distinction themselves? And to me, those are the categories that matter. Like the categories that people create within their communities. And if people aren't saying, well, like, an internet story versus an oral story, they're just talking about a story. Um, so I think I just follow the lead of how people interact with the information rather than, well, let me say it's this medium versus that medium. And not that the medium doesn't matter, but I think for some things it matters more than others. And in the case of what I study, I don't know that um, it depends, like gossip versus like a wide scale rumor versus like an urban legend that has like broader um, impact and broader, people have a broader awareness of it. Like maybe that's going to be different. But if you're like in the community and it's just like localized gossip, that tends to be more oral anyway. So I don't know. I try not to be too much of a stickler about it. I just like follow the lead of the information and what people do. So
Well, let me ask you this question, um, because as you were explaining that, it I guess occurred to me there is a difference between rumor, gossip, urban legend, and things like this, right? And you kind of hinted to it, but could you kind of expound upon that for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, I think like gossip and rumor, I think they're like all cousins to each other in some way. But gossip tends to be, more about people that you know within like a tighter network. So think of small town or the people in the department that you work in or something like that, where there's this knowledge. You either know the person or know other person really well because of overlapping actual networks. Rumor can be used in the same way as gossip, but also tends to be able to have like a wider, you can like use it more broadly. Could be stories that are circulating in the community about people you don't know, or like a disease is going around, or you know what's going on in the financial markets or whatever. But it doesn't necessarily always have to do with anybody so that the circulation of rumor, you know has like a broader scope to it. Urban legend, I think it's just another type of rumor, but it tends to be one that it is not even always urban. uh, Despite the nomenclature, I think it tends to be one where there's like an undercurrent of like a fear of some unknown conspiracy that's happening through some power. Or I mean, that's like one of them, like the conspiracy theory version of urban legends. Or just one where, because sometimes people just call them like contemporary legends to
Right.
distinguish them from like, oh, the legends of old, like the stories of this land or this famous person or whatever. um to talk about like how the various ills of our modern life are creating, something weird, like, mass produced food. And now, you're eating a Kentucky Fried Rat when you go,
Right.
'cause you're not cooking food at home. And that's one of it's like, it just sort of plays on those anxieties that we have about our contemporary society. And the way in which I think really urban legends and or contemporary legends really play on this fear that we have from living in society where we're all interconnected in some way, but we don't know each other. And so we always have these fears of like what this group is doing or what that group is doing or something like that. It's very like fear laden type of genre.
John. So you've mentioned two words that kind of came to my mind. That's why I kept pointing like this. One, conspiracy. When you were sharing rumor and urban legend, even when you were sharing about localized gossip, the
Mm,
conspiracy was going through my mind. As in, I see how that fits. Um, and also genre when it comes to, I guess, type of stories or telltales or folk
mm,
tales, right? And so now when we speak of I guess I should ask you this
yeah.
first, because I wanted to get into this folktale folklore conversation, particularly there's a different implication when it comes to black and diasporic than Western, and
Mm,
a lot of it starts in black diasporic exchange of stories.
mm.
Talk to us about that.
Okay, but like, can you clarify exactly what your question is? I wasn't clear what you're saying about like what the importance of
Well, so
folklore is for Black communities in the diaspora, or
absolutely,
folk tales
but
in
in
general.
regards to these stories and tales and legends and gossip and rumors and everything else that becomes a folk narrative.
That's interesting. I think that I've actually always been more interested in these informal narratives, to tell you the truth. So, like, I haven't been one to like look into like, oh, the Brer Rabbit stories or things like that, um, or like the John the Conqueror or anything like that. I've always been more interested in the fact that we might have these more like formalized, more well-known tales, but that like in our communities, and this might be where I connect to what you're asking about. Our communities, they hold a lot of knowledge in the informal realm, and like how we teach each other, the knowledge that we pass down, and sometimes that doesn't like come in the form of like a coherent narrative. And so I think by sometimes looking at the narratives that like look good in books, or a collection of narratives, that you can make, and draw some illustrations of, like you can like miss some of the informal narratives, which then tend to be more interesting to me. Because to me, like in my book where I talk about advice giving, like I don't think that's always been a thing that people have thought about as a like a genre or whatever, right? But there are conventions to advice giving. I don't know, I haven't studied what that advice giving looks like in the African American community, but I think there are people who have, right? These like communities of care and passing along knowledge and like learning how to, nurture each other and nurture the knowledge that we have within our communities, right? And not assuming that to be Black is to be pathological or to be ignorant or not have anything to share. Which was the starting point for my book that you mentioned, right? My starting point was that in the literature, Black people have been, whether in the diaspora or in Africa, have been presumed to be like either blank slates or just full of ignorance, right? Waiting to be rescued by various white saviors of different types. Um, but my baseline assumption was something very different. Like if there's a high rate of AIDS in the community, you best believe everybody knows about AIDS. Everybody's dealt with it. They may not be dealing with it quite like the officials expect people to, or they may be behaving as folks they see as irrational, but you had best believe that like there's something happening below the surface of what is being like detected in like various surveys and things like that, where people are struggling with this issue and creating different types of solutions that are not always present to the eye, because you're not asking those types of questions that are going to get at like, well, how do you deal with XYZ, instead of asking like, instead of asking like, did you do this, did you do this, do you do this other thing, do you take precaution in this way? If you leave that off the table of what's been prescribed to people and ask what people try to do to deal with the issue, you're going to start to get different answers. And so that's what I was looking into, like how is the knowledge passed down. And there's a lot of informal ways that people pass down knowledge that doesn't always get detected by some of the various research instruments that are, you know, common, especially in like health, you know, health behavior related research.
So, I mean, there's so many questions I have, particularly from what you just said. Let's just start at something that the question sounds simple, but as you know, it is so not. And I'm so looking forward to asking you this. What is folklore to you?
To me personally,
Yes.
yeah, to me personally, I see folklore as the um like an expression. It's about human expression, right? It's about human expression and the creation of community through expressive culture. So I look at those things that help to show our values, that help to bind us together, that help to tell us a story about ourselves, that help to create a sense of like a community aspiration. Like we may not actually be living this thing that's reflected in this ritual, but at least that's what we're striving toward, or all of those various things. So I think like, I don't know if that's simply put, that's how I perceive folklore. That's what it means to me.
Well, that was actually one of, if not the one of the most direct answers for the actual question, which is good.
Oh,
What
okay.
you
Well,
kind
I
of
teach undergraduate students, so.
There you have it. You got to break it down to its most basic. So let me ask you this. You kind of spoke to it, but I want to ask you directly, based on your definition of folklore
Mm.
and your interests, right? What was it that connected you? And based on your discussing or using, for an example, advice in your book, because there's quite a few things in the book that they reading them, they're humorous situations, but they're not necessarily humorous because these are like
Mm.
real life situations. What
Yeah.
about your interest folklore and the idea of AIDS in these multiple different capacities in this community? How did this come together for you? What did you see? What inspired it?
Oh, it's just I explain it in the very beginning of the book, so you can just read that. I'm just kidding. I'm not kidding.
If you saw my face, I was like,
No, I do though. I do explain it.
you
It's
do.
and it is that so if I don't explain it again here, then maybe I can like compel people to buy that book. So you're kind of messing up my little game here, Lamont. So
Give us a slight summary.
I can tell you. It's not a long story actually. No, so are interested in how I came into folklore or how I came into this particular project, the one of the
We're going to get into folklore later. This
okay.
particular project.
So for that project, it's because during the time I was in graduate school and trying to figure out what I wanted to do for my dissertation research, I didn't come into the school. I didn't come into to study folklore with a project in mind, though I know that's not uncommon that people do. Um, I had to like come to that or develop that idea. Um, but during that time, it was kind of like the height of the AIDS epidemic in sub-Saharan Africa, in terms of like infection rates and the kind of like media attention it's getting. Like you don't see a lot of media attention now, though there is a little bit since the U.S. aid that's helped to pay for some of the AIDS medication has now been kind of like cut off. So thanks whoever's in charge, and whoever's in charge's henchmen are. Um, anyway, I don't care about being political. So at that time, there was a lot of media attention around AIDS in Africa, and there was just like a lot of zany talk. And as like Black person, you're used to the media just presuming that like Black people, African people are different types of people. And it was almost as if like there was this, it's not gleeful, but it was almost this like, yes, you see, the African people are doing XYZ, and that's why the AIDS infection rate is so high. And, you know, of course, there were also people like pushing back, but the media was telling crazy stories like, oh, the AIDS infection rate is high because people think that if you have sex with a virgin, you'll be cured or whatever of the disease, and like that's what people are saying. And I'm just like, you know what? I'll believe it when I hear it for myself. That's the thing. That's the story, right? And so to me, there was so many stories around AIDS, and there was like so many like supposing like this is the narrative that's circulating in Southern Africa that's responsible for the high infection rates. And I'm like, are those the stories that people are telling? Are those really the stories? Is that how people are talking about it? I mean, not to say that like, you can always find a few cases of exceptional, like bad behavior anywhere, obviously, but to say that those few bad actors represent like how the whole incidence rate of AIDS in that HIV/AIDS in that region were, it just sounded crazy to me. It sounded like the usual kind of like bias that we have in the media, in the West in general. It's not just the media. Media
Right.
helps to fuel it, but those are the biases that we carry within our culture. And again, culture is not always like good. Like culture, we carry a lot of bad inheritances along with our good inheritances. Um, so my point was to go to do research in Southern Africa and one of these regions that they saw as like where the um, potentially as one of these places where people might believe this thing and see like what do people really talk about and how do they really deal with the sense of risk. I decided to work with women in particular, but you know, in my understanding, the stories that people told were much more mundane, but also much more. I mean, they were they were much more heart wrenching because they were more real to the reality of how what people had to deal with on a daily basis, rather than like a few exceptional stories of whatever being blown out of proportion. So that's kind of what I did. And actually, now that I think back on it, um, I like that I started the book on the idea of advice, because advice is one of those things that people don't think about as like a genre, but there were conventions to advice giving, um, to the not just the ideas, but how people express themselves. Um, in the situations in which advice was given, who got to tell who what. So there are various conventions that I thought like, it was like a pattern communication. And to me, to be a pattern communication that had like some clear patterns makes it a genre, makes me want to call that folklore. But it's also like so common. Like we're
Right,
always giving advice. We don't think that we've like learned ways of doing it. We don't think
right,
that we are following any conventions, right? But at the same
right.
time, we're passing along knowledge, right? We're passing along
Well,
things that we learned.
if I'm not mistaken, you talk about the context behind some of these advice and what was I guess being uh, 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 the message that was being given in some cases. Could you speak to that
Well, if you could
without
you?
giving too much away?
No, you can give as much away as you want to. Like I'm not putting knowledge behind a paywall. So it's fine. The book is expensive. You don't need to buy it. If anybody wants to email me, like I can send you some the files. But no, I don't want the publisher to know that I said that. Um yeah, I'm not sure what you're referring to with regards to the context. So maybe you could like, I think there's something in particular you want me to speak to, but you
Yeah,
probably read
well,
it more recently than me. So maybe you just
well, they're the different meanings of advice coming from different people in any particular situation.
are you talking about like as I'm like interviewing these women, like wives usually, like if they're getting the advice from their family versus getting the advice from someone in the village that they married into and the family they married
Yes,
into, that
ma'am.
kind of
Yes,
thing.
ma'am. Yes, ma'am.
Oh, okay. Now, what was the question about that exactly?
Well, so along with having a pattern,
Mm.
and I guess being considered, as you said, a folk narrative and things of this nature. What did you find? Oh, well, I'm sure I know you found it, but what? Talk to us about the context. If there was
Oh,
different
okay.
context.
Yeah. So, I mean, I would say that both for the like if a woman was getting advice, she had trouble in her marriage. That's like sort of the context of all of this. It was a lot about marriage because at the time there was research that women who were in marriages, these committed relationships, were also often like more endangered. Um, in particular ways. I mean, part of this also comes from the failure to people see the vulnerability that men have as well. But also, like, as a new researcher, it was easier for me to conduct research with other women. So
Well,
um
let me frame it to you also this way, because context is like a very ambiguous word, like community. So forgive me,
yeah, yeah.
but like uh, advice framed specifically either because it's a woman or either because the family member of that woman gave the advice, juxtapose the village or family of the husband giving the advice. With their different meanings behind
Right. I
the.
mean,
Does that make sense?
what I was going to say is that, like, to a large extent, the advice often overlapped, actually, right?
Okay.
Because, in marriage conventions, there's like, it's like agreement between the families, right? And like both families are invested in the marriage staying in place, which is, sealed with the exchange of various gifts between the families and things like that. And so, sometimes there's reluctance even on the part of a woman's family for them to tell that wife, you know you should leave this marriage if that's the case. I'm not saying that's what people need to do. Um, but there was usually a lot of advice given on both sides at the beginning of a conflict on how to maintain that marriage, because the maintenance of a marriage was also like, a way for people to the family who's received some gifts to keep hold of those gifts, and not everything was about exchange of stuff. People overrate that sometimes. But there was just this belief that you had to that it took time to get things right in a marriage, and that marriage is perseverance. And there was this built-in notion of hardship in marriage, especially for women, right? Marriage is perseverance, marriage is endurance, and that was just an expression that everyone would share. um, and so, again, that's something that's understood on both sides of the family. On the other end, like, if relations were breaking down over time and getting worse and worse, it was the woman's family that she, left, who would be the first to say, like, just like pack it in. This husband hasn't like fulfilled his responsibilities to you as a husband, and so you just need to go home because he's endangering you with, bringing this other woman into the marriage, or something like that. It could be anything, or well, those were I bring that up because it was the main complaint, but it was also the kind of complaint that was especially relevant to the kind of research I was doing.
Right.
Um, not that there people didn't have other things to complain about, which, the usual things: money, the things that plague relationships everywhere around the world, like money and outside relationships and things like that. Outside relationships that weren't agreed upon. Um, so yeah, and then the usually the husband's family will be more reluctant to say go home, but once in a while things would be so bad that they would be like, you should just leave. You should just go.
Right.
Our son is not doing right. You just need to go. um, so
um. So I want to ask. I have to ask you this before I ask you what brought you to the field. The reason why I have to ask you this because you're an academic, you're a scholar, you're a professor,
mhm,
you work at a university, but your scholarship is based on ethnographic fieldwork. Like you was there, you did the public thing to a degree, and I say to a degree because we're not talking about public facing programming, which I'm sure you did that as well. So as a black person, as a black woman,
mm.
right? Talk to us about um, the idea of doing ethnographic field work. And then you're not even just going to another community, you went to a whole nother continent.
Mm. So my experience as a Black woman doing ethnography.
Well, go in the field, right? Going out in the field.
Mhm.
I use this term lightly because we have to be very clear about the terminologies and the vocabulary we use.
Yeah, yeah,
Inserting yourself in someone's community,
right.
and I don't know of your connections,
Yeah,
but I
you know what? I think that's a I think I'd like to make a distinction. You know,
please.
I wouldn't say that I inserted myself in the community. And I mean, I'm not the kind of person who is going to fake a closer relationship with people than what I had, for the sake of writing something that seems like I was embedded or something like that. I wouldn't say that. Like I lived, adjacent to when I did my dissertation field work, which this book is based on. I did go back a couple times after that, after I graduated and learned more, and then I wrote the book. But I was there for, it was like an 8 month stretch or something, and I was living, adjacent or right next to those villages where I did most of that my interviews. But it wasn't like, oh, and now I am enmeshed in the life worlds of this community. I don't think that would be that's not really what happened. I went and did research. I interviewed people. I tried to learn as much as I could. I asked lots of questions. I doubled back and talked to people a few times over. Um, but to say that I was like somehow embedded, um I don't think that's like genuine to what my experience was. And so that's why I'm still a person who will use words like informant, because like I don't want to play the
Oh,
game. Yeah, you are informing me, but then at the end of the day, I'm still doing this writing. I'm still like I'm
right,
still putting everything together. And so like everybody who shared with me everyone who shared with me, like, this work comes out of their words, right? But then at the end of the day, I'm the one who had the opportunity to bring it all together, right?
right, right.
And so I think that sometimes with the fields that use ethnography in the last, I would say maybe like 30 years, this idea of, partnerships with people um, that you work with who are the subject of your work. And I think that like if I was there for like multiple years or things like that, that what and we worked on a project together, that might be something that I could talk about more, right? But the reality of the research was that like I went and I learned from people, I talked to them, I heard their stories, I heard what they wanted, and but at the end of the day, we didn't become partners in the writing or the analysis of all these
Right.
different stories. And so I didn't feel right. That would be a mischaracterization of
Let me ask you a question. I'm so
actually happening.
happy. I am so happy you said that. So now I have to ask you this. Did you go to social functions with any of the informants? Did you go to eat dinner? Were you shown, taught, or experienced any culturally significant engagements or anything sacred?
Did I engage in things that were sacred? Yeah, sometimes I did. Some people would feed you. We would come. You'd be like, no, we don't have time for a 5 hour tea. Um, I was like, I've got to catch a bus. I don't have time for a 5 hour tea. But like for me, like the field was a place where it's just so much work. So let's say that like I spent the day interviewing, and this is just me for like having built my schedule this way. When the day is over, I'm first of all, you're exhausted. I don't want to do any socializing. I gotta eat dinner and I gotta go home and write a whole bunch of notes. I got to write notes, notes, and notes, and notes upon notes, because I was like stacking interviews like 3, 4 a day, which was probably too much. It was like I have to learn as much as possible. right? So so it was like a lot. So what I'm trying to say is that, like, yes, on occasion, but that wasn't like the norm, right? The norm was like, I work, now I'm tired, now I'm,
It
gonna
was
go.
it was a business interaction almost.
Yeah, like I was a researcher, right? So I
Right.
mean, if I think, like, the places where I feel like you get more of that familiarity is when you interview fewer people. And you're really like focusing on, like, a few people's experiences or life stories or things like that. Like I see other people do research like this, and I'm like, it's so in depth in terms of like the richness of very particular people's experience. But I think I was looking for something different. I'm just like, what is the information that's being like diffused within the community? And to do that, you have to like talk to a lot of different people. So it's in that sense, to me, it means that, like, I didn't necessarily focus on like a few individuals and like follow them in their experiences to the extent that I see other people do, and I really admire that work. But this project wasn't that. um
Right. Well,
yeah.
which is fine, and the project was great. I'm just happy you made that distinction. Particularly happy you made that distinction as a Black scholar, because to be fair, there is a stigma on researcher informant relations when it comes to or the idea, not when it comes to, but the idea of being extractive, right? And so
Oh,
we
yeah, yeah. I mean, yeah, at the end of the day, I wouldn't actually say it was a very equal partnership in a sense, because I probably got a lot more out of it than what they got out of like telling me the story. But people do like telling stories though. So let, let's not let's not put that aside. But it wasn't extractive in this, there I think there is something to that. And then I'm like, well, okay, should I feel guilty and then not talk to people? Or do I try to write a book that like shows the kind of like diversity of people's experiences and tries to push back against these narratives of like that exoticizes like African culture and beliefs with respect to facing epidemic diseases or something like that. um and then of course I get something out of it. It will be a lie. It's like it's my dissertation project. And also I just had this curiosity, and I just like wanted to know. So um you know so of course I'm getting something out of it. Like when I'm learning, you get like a charge out of like hearing people's stories. So there's a lot of different motivations. Sometimes people want their story told, so I don't want to discount that people are getting that out of it.
right,
um Even though
right. Well,
everyone's anonymized. Yeah,
well, no,
so but
yeah,
yeah, so yeah, so I think, the people might listen to me and just be like, "Oh, she's like an extractive researcher or something like that." And I think that's
that wasn't what I was saying.
no,
They
no,
better not get
I'm
that.
not saying that's what you're saying. I think that
Oh,
people
okay.
might listen to me and come to that conclusion, and I'm okay for them to come to that conclusion because I can see the ways in which it wasn't a partnership, in that sense. And, I as much as I tried to follow the terms of what people talked about, I did in the end of the day like decide what questions to ask and what topics to focus on. Um, so it comes to that, and then maybe I'm also manipulated myself by larger forces. So that was a period where if you were doing research on AIDS, then there would be funding available. And that actually really distorted a lot of research interest in Africa in general, because,
Right,
you have to like connect anything that you're doing to AIDS because that's where the funding was. Um, it wasn't just distorting research, it kind of also distorted, like the non-governmental organization missions all over the place. It was an interesting time. I don't know what's happening now. I might have be inadvertently following trends because now I'm doing things more related to the environment. But it's also just something I care about. as well, and was something that, like, started coming up at the end of my this that book project that we've been talking about this whole time. But then I look around and, like, oh, a lot of people are interested also in the environment as well. It's not just me. So so yeah, I
Well,
don't
no,
know
so
what question I'm answering
I'll
anymore.
ask you about your current work. The reason why I wanted to, I kind of zeroed in on that is because this idea that the actual working relationship between a community member and a researcher is there's a negative connotation, and I think um on some merit and some levels that's disingenuous because it's not always that. But we can have a whole conversation about that another time. I
I
want to
know.
ask.
I mean, I like the thing is, like, I live here. I don't like live there, and I know some people like manage to like create project and partnerships across the distance. But to me, I find that a very hard prospect um, to do that. If I'm not living somewhere full time. So long distance relationships are hard.
I, I dig it. So now I can ask you,
Yeah.
what brought you to the field of folklore?
All right. All right. Yeah, so I would say that it was probably Scotland. Um,
Hmm.
well, when I was an undergrad, I came to the realization I was just really interested in studying, like human interaction and behavior. I don't know if decision making is the right word, but some like the dynamics of like how we as people relate to each other. So I took a couple classes in this, a couple classes in that, like psychology. I was like, no, it's not it. I mean, it's not it for me. Sociology, I did major in sociology, but at the end, I felt like there was like a little bit something like missing in terms of really getting energized for me. Like I took all the classes and like I'm not getting energized. I'm not getting like inspired. So I did a study abroad, and I just like took some classes to fulfill my like humanities or culture distribution type thing. So I did that study abroad in Edinburgh, and yeah, I took classes on Scottish ethnology and things like that. And it was like that class. That's what they call folklore there, essentially. And the way they connected between like the various expressive cultural you know aspects of Scottish heritage to the history and people's values and whatever things like that. I was like, yeah, that's what I really want to do. I just want to see how I want to study people through culture. I want to study people through our expressive culture. Like that's how. Yeah, yes, I want to study human interaction and our dynamics, but I want to do it in through this lens. And so at that point, I, went back to my college, and we had like one folklore class. It was an anthropology department. I think that teacher, I won't name here, was like, oh, because I thought like, I think I might have said to him like, maybe I'll go to graduate school and study folklore. And I took another kind of folklore class through English. So like anything I could find my senior year. But that teacher in anthropology was like, no, you can't work in folklore. There's no jobs or something.
What?
I don't remember what they said, but it was the '90s, so I did. I decided to like pursue it anyway. Well, really, it didn't go to grad school till 2001, but in the end of the '90s, we thought like there was always going to be jobs and stuff, and that universities were going to be like a sacred institution. I didn't know anything. So if I had known anything, I don't know what I would do because, I still can't think of, another career. Like if everything comes crashing down here, I'm like, what will I do? I only know how to folklore.
Well,
So,
there's always going to be folklore.
oh, folklore is going to be there. Folklore is always going to be there. Folklore will make a way. Um, yeah, so that's what happened. And so, yeah, after college, I started looking around. There's still not a ton of graduate programs. I think there's less since then. But I applied to a few places and I got into a few places and I chose one, and that's the rest is history, or the rest is folklore.
The rest is folklore. So your introduction to it was a Scottish class
Hmm.
connecting culture into. And let me ask you, because
Yeah.
there is this idea of anthropology and literature and literary and things like this. Um, what was the basis of this course you took? Was they bringing these things together through literature? Were they looking at people interacting, or
The anthropology, so there were two classes, the anthropology class and the English class. The English class was basically looking at like, basically, I think mostly like early English literature that had come out of oral culture, or, you know, had a lot of elements that, echoed oral culture. Um, so that was that angle, how that class was put together, making the connection between folklore and literacy. The other class, I don't remember the details too much. I think it was mostly introducing a concepts of folklore and maybe some like big name scholars and the work that they did. Um, but it didn't work very hard to make a stark distinction between anthropology and folklore. And not in terms of the subject, maybe in terms of the theories that had been developed by the field and the preoccupations to some extent. But yeah, that's all I remember though. I mean, this is like 26 years ago, Lamont. So that's the best I could do.
no? I dig it. I dig it. Well, let me ask you this: we're going to come to
I
a
don't even
close.
know it's in there, if it's in there anymore. Like,
It seems to be,
it's
but
not
as
in
we
there.
and you currently you're into environment. Is it safe to say ecology and things of this nature?
I mean, sort of. Actually, I'm coming at it through a study of sacred sites.
Uh-huh.
Uh-huh.
So, well, is it black sites? Is it
This
just
is still
sites
in
that are sacred?
Malawi. This is Malawi.
Mhm.
The sites don't look black to me. They're, various colors upon the landscape. Um, but the sites are ones that are seen to be inhabited by spirits, or used to be inhabited by spirits, and may have been abandoned by those spirits with the degradation
Mm.
of the land. Um, so yeah. So I guess you could say in Malawi, it's like these are black sites, but I don't know if I am, and I'm not thinking about it that way because I don't know if people are thinking about those sites in those ways. I think they're more thinking about them as like, okay, it's very complicated. I'm kind of in the middle of trying to do the analysis of this.
Well,
Um,
can I ask you this question?
yeah.
Um, Culturally, folk belief wise,
Hmm.
what is it? Is it tribal? Is it local, or is it more of a broad belief in this sacred space?
So I think, I'm also working on a edited volume with other people who are doing research on sacred sites in Africa. So actually,
Okay.
what you find across broad swaths of the continent are this idea of places being, you know, inhabited by spirits, which is a very common idea. It's not even just in Africa, to be honest with
Right,
you.
right,
Um, but the way that people relate to them may depend on how close they are to those spaces, like because there's an idea of relatability or relationality to places. Like if your family has lived in a place for some generations and been buried in that place, then there's a notion of those spirits are going to be in those sacred, sort of like quote unquote undeveloped sites, right?
right,
So like, oh, the ancestors are up there. Like I'm doing this research on Mount Malanje in southern Malawi, and people will say, oh, if you're walking alone in the woods, and you or not, you don't have to be alone in this particular type of story. If you're walking in the forest, it's not very heavily forested anymore for reasons, but sometimes you might see someone you left behind who was like sick
right,
when you
right,
left them down in the village. Then you should just know that person has died. That's their spirit there or whatever. But there's also this like notion of those sacred places are places that are not to be overly used by people in terms of cultivation or cutting down the trees and things like
right,
that.
right,
And this is like maintained well in places like graveyards, but not so well in some of the places that became nature reserves, because they also became a source for resources to, you know, have firewood or to make charcoal, which requires like burning like old hardwood trees that have a lot of carbon capture in them and things like that. So like old established forests get destroyed. Um, but the discourse around it is really interesting because people are trying to figure out whose responsibility is it to protect these things, who has the right to the resources in the forest, because there used to be systems in the sort of pre-Christian era. There used to be systems where a priest or priestess who had some kind of responsibility over uh, a particular area would advise about how land was to be used or what sacrifices and offerings were to be made to make sure there's the rain and that you are appeasing the spirits of those places. Malanje is especially interesting site because of the mountain and the forest helped to create a kind of microclimate that allowed it to get rains more often than like other places, and now that's being disrupted. So like location and like a sense of local responsibility is like a big deal. And so now the government has got like 2 or 3 forestry people over like many like acres, hectares of land, and they can't really manage it. So they basically devolve to like the traditional authorities to have villages that live by particular places take care of these sites. And people are like, it's really troubling because they don't have tools or time and they don't get paid for it. There's a lot of things happening. Yeah. With that,
wow,
and it's a dangerous job that people are being asked to do voluntarily, but they're also being told that this is your land in the sense that in a traditional sense, even though
so it's
it
indigenous.
officially belongs to the government.
Oh, so wait,
So
let me
like
ask you real quick. So
so
this
like
is
in the
a
past, it was the sacred trust of particular communities to take care of that land, but then it became government land under colonialism, like government reserves, and then it's still government reserves after colonialism, but with a post-colonial, various post-colonial government regimes. Um, and now these governments, which have been kind of the loss for money specialists and structural adjustment programs, are now saying like, well, we can't afford all the personnel to do that. So we'll appeal to the traditional ideas that these lands belong to these people to have them do the patrolling themselves. but it still belongs to the government.
Right. Okay. So 1, 2, and 3, you answered my next question. Thank you.
Yeah.
So listen, I can ask you 20 more questions, but I won't because then you won't come back on the show.
Boy, am I
So,
supposed to come back? What did I just tell you everything now?
but I appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed it.
Yes. Oh, you need a
Okay,
verbal
good,
yes.
good.
Sorry, I was
Thank you
drinking
very
tea.
much. All right, great folks. We are celebrating Dr. Anika Wilson. She's the African American Folklorist of the Month. Find her multiple books in this next project she's working on, and we'll get at y'all soon.